Hello, dear friends, my lovely audiences, ladies and gentlemen, my dear fellow Americans, welcome to the East West Show. Jack Chow on the East West Show with the GNE TV. It's been a lot of concern for the past few weeks, ever since they decided that North and South Korea go together, or they walk hand in hand, the two presidents. And in the meantime, there is a scheduled visit for our president, Donald Trump, to go to either Pyongyang or Seoul or whoever, or even to the non-militarization zone, whatever, to further talk about. So there are lots of concerns about it. There are lots of trepidation to talk about. So today, to get to the point, I have my mentor, Honorable Mr. James Lee, former presidential consultant for both George H.W. Bush 41 and George W. Bush 43. Sir, welcome to the show.
Always good to be here, Jack.
I'm so honored that every time I'm in an emergency with a crying baby, though, I got to call you for help.
Yeah, no problem.
All right, good. So basically, the bigger question, for the bigger picture, though, what is happening or what are happening? We have Russia, China, North Korea, South Korea, and Japan, and the United States, all involved in the circle, in the subject. So now all of a sudden, we see a sudden change, which is totally to everybody's surprise. So what is happening or what are happening?
Well, I think that it's a surprise at the rapidity of how fast things have moved in North Korea over the past few months. I think if you talk to the Trump administration, they would say, we knew this was coming all along. The big change, I guess you could say, principally was obviously when President Trump became president and was inaugurated, his extremely blunt talk and deprecating remarks towards North Korea. The little fat man comments, the little rocket man comments that he made regarding Kim Jong-un, that raised a lot of eyebrows in diplomatic circles, and it was certainly not the way that a U.S. president has ever talked. But behind the scenes, what you also saw were a new series and rounds of economic sanctions that were put in place by this administration that were even tougher than all the sanctions that had gone through before, literally strangling the North Korean economy. So whether or not you believe it was Donald Trump's blunt talk, his willingness, for example, to engage in direct conversation with the North Koreans, or the impact of the economic sanctions, events conspired to move North Korea in a direction that we hadn't seen before. Now, there have been other treaties, there have been other discussions, there have been other talks, all of which North Korea has violated in the past. So everyone is cautiously optimistic. Yeah. But I think what's changed in this particular case is that North Korea, in Kim Jong-un's case, has done things that no North Korean leader has done before. And remember, this is a family business. He's the third, Kim
generation
to run it, and he has, for the first time, put denuclearization of the peninsula on the table. He's the first one to actually open up the idea of international U.S. inspectors to come in and look at the decommissioning of their nuclear site and their nuclear reactor. And he's also, just this past week, released 3 Americans that were being held hostage, essentially, from the president's demand. So all those things have moved positively. And what's remarkable also is the additional talk that's going on right now in terms of actually ending the armistice and signing an actual peace treaty and a non-aggression pact with the United States, effectively ending the Korean War. Remember, the Korean War never ended. We're still technically still the state of war with North Korea.
Because the tension is still there.
Yeah, and the armistice only kind of stopped hostilities. It didn't render a peace treaty. The other thing that was interesting also was the symbolic image of Kim meeting with President Moon of South Korea at the demilitarized zone, and both of them walking on either side of the DMZ and the demarcation line was a very powerful image. The summit that they just had, where Kim was the first North Korean leader to actually come into South Korea and meet via train, is another significant act. So there are a lot of things happening that have made people scratch their heads, be cautiously optimistic. We know North Korea's track record, so in the immortal words of somebody like President Ronald Reagan, when he was talking about the Russians and the Soviet Union back then, you have to trust but verify. So that's going to have to be the same
Trust
situation.
but verify.
Yeah.
Okay, well, of course. We give them thumbs up for things going towards the better, towards the uplifting direction. But the concern is that the public concern is that things are happening so fast.
Yeah.
All right. There's one thing we got to understand. After 3 generations, the nuclearization of North Korea has been something they work for 3 generations and decades after decades after decades. And only about a month and a half ago, they were swearingly saying that we will, will bomb U.S. We can reach as far as Chicago somewhere, something like that. Only a month and a half ago, all of a sudden they say, okay, come over and all the time. So there must be something there that, in addition to what is happening, that we public know, that we do not know.
Well, I think, some of the reporting that's coming out lately is that, Mike Pompeo, when he was CIA director before he became Secretary of State for President Trump, visited North Korea, met with Kim personally. That was the first time they had a cabinet official make that kind of visit, and setting up the stage for the summit, which is expected at the end of May or the beginning of June between President Trump himself and Kim Jong-un, which would be the first meeting between a sitting U.S. president and a North Korean leader. So there are a lot of things happening very quickly. I think also some of the interesting stuff that's come out recently and some of the reporting has been the fact that the United States has moved remarkably fast to embrace the opportunity by taking a much more narrow diplomatic approach, working closely with South Korea, but not doing the large multilateral type of approach involving China and Russia and Japan and all these other countries that in a lot of ways previously kind of bogged things down because everyone wanted their piece of the pie. But because the United States is kind of doing this in a quick fire way with a smaller diplomatic team, frankly, you're seeing results that we never would have thought we would have gotten before.
All right, okay, good. That could be a very nice statement. However, there's a little something more to talk about. The Americans moving positively fast is the one side of the story. The other side is that militarily we're scaring them enough, right? We have caused them attention.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, internationally, the bombing of Syria might push a little bit to his changing position.
Sure.
Do you think the two will factor?
Well, you have to. We don't know what's happening in Kim's mind, obviously, but you do have to wonder about all the other changes that the Trump administration has put in place that have caused a lot of consternation, but also may have unwittingly or knowingly helped push this thing along. For example, the desire by Trump to go into China, for example, and be tough with them on trade, implementing tariffs, his willingness to start a trade war, the fact that the Chinese economy is really suffering right now and not experiencing the growth that it does, China being the #1 supporter of North Korea. There's question as to whether or not how far China is willing to go in supporting North Korea, whether or not that backing is still going to be there. Obviously, what happened in Syria, the fact that President Trump has ordered 2 missile strikes now and 2 attacks on Syrian assets and Iranian assets in response to the use of chemical weapons, his willingness to project U.S. power by sending 2 U.S. carrier battle groups to China, the South China Sea and also off the Korean Peninsula, have been not unnoticed. So you might wonder if you're Kim, just what this guy is going to do. Democrats are always in consternation over how volatile President Trump is and how bombastic he is on Twitter and in his statements. In this particular case, it might have worked for the president's favor because you really, if you're a foreign leader, you may not know what he's going to do next.
In other words, it accidentally happened that way.
Well, I mean, Democrats have always claimed that the possibility of an accidental war under President Trump is incredibly high. That narrative may feed into the thinking of some of our enemies who may be worried about the fact that, an accidental war may happen.
Well, it sounds legit. Sounds very legit. I wasn't thinking that way. putting together, there might be information for you for reference, my dear friend. Me and my team always, all the time, try to be responsible. Be responsible by that, I mean that we will gather all information that we believe you might need for your own reference to take your own judgment about what's happening on the world. Today with me, to my pleasure, and also to my team, is my dear friend, Honorable James Lee, former presidential consultant for both Bush, H.W. Bush 41 and George W. Bush 43. What an honor. So what analysis. We started to see something with the legit points that will make sense. So stay with us. When we come back, we will put together a little something, overall picture to see what's happening on that level. So stay with us, please. Hello, lovely friends, my dear audiences. Welcome back to the show. Today is one of a very special show. Every time, like I said, when I have a crying baby, when I'm in trouble, I get a call to my friend, Honorable James Lee, former presidential consultant for both H.W. Bush and W. Bush. So, welcome back, sir, to the show once again. You look back into history, though, you always find out that the tripod situation of the major powers, right? And nowadays, it's still the same thing. It is China, it is Russia, it is the United States, all right? So I have no problem. The three each play their own games, right? Okay, now, in the middle, where or what does this Kim stand, what he's doing now, to his favor? To whose favor?
Well, I think that when you look at the position that Kim is in right now, that may reveal why he's moving to negotiation diplomacy where he acted belligerently before. Part of it was that, that he had always had China in his back pocket. China was willing to support him no matter what. But China's situation has changed a lot because the economy has changed for them.
China is backing off, no longer.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can see signs of it. For example, China has stopped the repatriation of capital and currency out of China. You see investments overseas drying up. For example, in Los Angeles alone, last year they invested over $1 billion. Chinese companies invested over $1 billion in real estate development. This year, less than $200 million. So the spigot's starting to dry up a little bit because China needs to keep that money at home to try to keep their economy going. So sending money out to support North Korea on the same level that it did before may be problematic for them, which forces Kim to kind of rethink what he needs to do.
And it's proven to be problematic.
Yeah, because under the threat of sanctions and the sanctions that North Korea has, China is literally the only country that supplies North Korea with any commodities or goods or oil and so forth. And even then, they're under a lot of scrutiny. I mean, there was the case just a few months ago where satellite imagery of Chinese ships offloading freight and commerce into North Korean ports was caught and captured and ridiculed in the UN that China was busting sanctions. So it's a difficult situation for China because the question for China comes back, well, what do we get out of supporting North Korea?
Allow me a little insertion. There might be some kind of reason or explanation where which the public does not know, the public world. U.S. China, and there's only a small river there. All right, the people there, they kind of go across each other. They have grandmother there, mother here, whatever relatives. Okay, now, what I read about this, these people along the river are suffering. They're suffering almost to death. So from the humanitarian point of view, sending some aid, and China has cut itself down to the very bottom, only give them some food, that's it. No military whatsoever. And that is so good to help with the situation that the public recognize. So I give a thumb up for that shrinking of help. We used to go trains after
Yeah,
trains
sure.
after trains across the river to their military support.
Yeah, I mean, the level of support from China is obviously diminished because of China's belt tightening and its own economic situation. So that certainly leads a lot of speculation as to what Kim's exit strategy is out of all this. The fact of the matter is that if he can reach a negotiated settlement with South Korea, a negotiated settlement with the United States that satisfies Japan, for example, if he gives up denuclearization, if he gives up his weapons, if he accepts limits on ballistic missile technology, the inevitable question on the other side is, what does Kim want? And we have
In return.
we don't know yet what that part of the equation is because we don't know what he's seeking. So I think it's pretty clear from the U.S. side and the South Korean side and the Japanese side what we want. We want North Korea to give up its nuclear technology. We want to destroy their nuclear weapons. We want them to accept restrictions on their ballistic missile program, and we want them to improve their human rights situation and lift some of the constraints that their government has. It's ironic because what's happening in North Korea is almost identical to the situation we're facing in Iran. Right now, not only because North Korea supplied Iran with its initial designs and missile components.
I was so willing to enter into that Iran subject
and
when later on I have some time.
I think there's a lot of questions going on right now as to whether or not we can broker a deal in North Korea that accomplishes all these things and use that as a template for Iran.
I see. Okay. After all, what kind of role Russia is playing in this whole thing?
Well, that's the thing.
Russia.
They're not playing any role right now. They're not involved in the diplomatic initiatives going on. They're frozen out. In a lot of ways, China also has taken a back seat to this, which for those two countries that are so used to being involved in situations like this, for them to be frozen out by the United States is a little disconcerting to them, I'm sure, for Xi and for Vladimir Putin. And I think that might be geopolitically moving down the road. One of the things that they're worried about is that under President Trump, if he gets a big victory here in North Korea, what does that mean for American prestige around the world and other places?
All right.
And I
can use that as a model.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that is the interesting backstory to all this that still has to play out.
And also, the public has a comment or a concern about the fact that probably the recent bombing, the latest bombing to Syria, had taught them a lesson. Because they thought for a while that Russian will be on their back.
Yeah.
Right. And Russian, of course, using that Syria example, what they see is that, okay, even before 20 hours before the action, they kind of withdrew to nowhere.
Well, the interesting thing about the second Syrian retaliation attack against their use of chemical weapons was, one, this time it was multilateral. The United States, British, and French forces all participated, which is different. It's the first time you've had all three countries involved in launching missiles and launching attacks. The other thing that was interesting, the Russians have some of their top flight military hardware down in Syria to defend their air base.
They were there for quite some time.
And defend their naval base. What was interesting was that when the onslaught of missiles started flying over, the Russians never turned on their radar and never launched missiles of their own to defend against. Now, part of this is that the U.S. and their allies were very careful not to target Russian assets. But at the same time, you have to wonder whether or not the Russians didn't want to escalate this and get involved. And also, it wouldn't be just an escalation between the Russians and the Americans. It'd be an escalation between Russia and Britain and France. And remember, contemporaneous to all this, the British already had a beef with the Russians because the Russians allegedly made an attempt to kill one of their former spy masters, who is now a British citizen. Him and his daughter were both poisoned by a chemical toxin that could only come out of a Russian stockpile. So those relationships are so low right now that Russia is in also a kind of a delicate diplomatic position where they're increasingly becoming isolated.
In other words, the Russians might have a good reason to back off from that, but the backing off Russia has taught Kim Jong-un, about what kind of lesson he will learn. So that, and then at this very moment, here comes the American offer. Well, that might push him to accept.
Well, it's clear that Kim right now doesn't have any friends.
That guy is isolated.
So,
yes.
you know, to be in that kind of situation, you don't have a lot of options left. So, by seizing this opportunity, if we don't believe Kim, he's seizing this opportunity to buy time and space for himself to figure out what his next step is going to be, which I'm not sure anybody really knows what that is. If we do believe Kim, then he's taking this initiative so that he can fundamentally change the nature of the North and South Korea relationship and reap some economic benefit for himself.
Question is that can we trust them? Can we trust him or can we trust them? When them, I say North and the South.
Yeah.
All together, right? And public concern also lies in the fact that they worry about either the Kim is playing a game or when they're playing a game with Kim. Altogether, they kind of using us as a tool to push them together, the so-called reunification.
Sure.
If that happens whatsoever, so that could be a big possibility, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, my dear friends, today with me on this East-West show, to everybody's honor, is my dear friend, Honorable James Lee, former presidential consultant for both George H.W. Bush 41 and W. Bush 43. For years, he's been supporting this show. He's been supporting the community with the super knowledge and the wisdom he has in analyzing what's happening. Every time there's a crying baby, I call my problem crying babies. I call him, and he never turned me down. He comes up, for example, today, the traffic, such a big traffic, right? Good, very good. So, my dear friends, audiences, so let's take a very short moment now. When we come back, we want to drag over the concern about who cheats who, right? What if games are being played? Games could be played by Kim, games could be played by one, or the both together. Well, so, and then do we have tactics? Do we have certain plan restored for it? Okay, stay with us. We'll be right back, please. Hello, lovely friends, my dear fellow Americans. Welcome back to the discussion about North Korea and South Korea, the Korean Peninsula, the whole thing, versus the United States versus the world. Today with me, my dear friend, Honorable James Lee, former presidential consultant for both Bush 41 and 43, shedding lights on this issue with lots of questions I have reserved for him. Those are the questions are the ones on learning that you are coming this morning, they send me emails with their questions. One of the questions, the biggest one, will say that, could Kim is playing games? Because the reason for asking that is that he's been working, the whole generation, 3 generations, been working towards the nuclearization for decades after decades after decades. How come he will just give it up within overnight? Right? There must be something behind. So Kim playing games. Or the North-South reunification is a subject also for them as Koreans working for decades after decades, ever since the war, ending of the war, which ended or never ended is a different story. Okay, now, could that be the fact that they use that as a momentum to push themselves to be united only, forget U.S., the whole thing? So your reading, please, sir?
Well, I mean, the track record demonstrates that North Korea can't be trusted. So I think that pretty much is self-explanatory. The question is, can you achieve a deal that includes enough standards for verification to say that, okay, North Korea is going to get rid of their nuclear weapons, and then what's the next chapter? I think that if you want to be philosophical for a second, you have to understand that, Kim is the third Kim to run North Korea. He's already had the luxury of seeing his grandfather and his father run North Korea and pretty much become an autocratic dictator and then die in office. Kim is still a relatively young man, and you have to ask yourself whether or not he can see in the history, okay, my grandfather did this for 50 years and then died. My dad did this for 50 years and died. Do I want to do the same thing? Or do I want something different for my life?
Okay.
it's entirely possible that he's kind of realized, I don't want to just kind of do this job, run this little country, and then just die in office.
The same way like they did.
And go into a mausoleum somewhere and end up being, a picture on the wall. Do I want something more out of my life? So that might be a psychological reason why all this stuff is happening. Again, if you don't believe Kim, then he's doing this all to just buy time. But again, that begs the question on the back end, for what purpose? Because even if he were to gain some time and maybe do a trade and talk about getting rid of nuclear weapons and then get a lift in economic sanctions and have some luxuries come back into the country, they can all be easily taken away again. So the cycle of start and stop, doesn't end unless he breaks that cycle by saying, okay, I want to get off this treadmill and I want to try something different. We don't know yet what he wants because as part of the negotiation process, we don't have any public information yet as to what he wants.
However, the international survey says that he is only a few months away from fully nuclearized with that thing.
Well, they're pre-nuclearized already. They have a stockpile of nuclear weapons.
Yeah, they say probably it's only time that he wanted.
I mean,
he's gaining the time. Could be that.
The difficulty for North Korea right now is that their nuclear weapons are not missile compatible right now, meaning they can't be placed on top of a ballistic missile and then shot like an ICBM, like other countries have. So you could argue that they're buying time so they can miniaturize their nuclear warheads to be able to put them on a missile, and then they're clearly a global threat. Again, it's all speculation until we get closer to a summit where there's an agenda and we know what they're asking for. Right now, they haven't released any demands. We do know that South Korea and North Korea have met each other part way in a whole series of issues. The South has stopped propaganda broadcasts into the North, vice versa. They've started dismantling their speaker and audio systems.
They started loudspeakers already.
Right, and the North has done the same thing. The North has released 3 American prisoners per American demands. The North has gone ahead and said, well, we're willing to denuclearize. We're going to stop our testing. We're going to stop launching missiles, which they have. And we're going to allow U.S. inspectors to look at the decommissioning. So those are all things that we wanted, now we're getting. And if they hold true, then the next question is, okay, what does North Korea want?
And
exactly, that's the thing we don't know.
Speaking of that, though, you're talking about incentives, right? The incentive, Kim might have a bigger incentive, which is easier understood because he needs food. He needs to get out of the isolation, so on and so forth, right?
Yeah.
Okay, now, what shall benefit the South? I'm looking to find out what is the incentive for the South to shake hands with the North to get Kim into the deal.
Well, I think in Kim's case, look, it's a family business running that country. He doesn't want to give up the family business. So he wants to stay in power.
All right.
The model for him to be able to do that might be China. Because in China's case, the assembly just voted lifelong power to President Xi. So he's essentially president for life now, which is an amazing thought. But the ability to create a communist government overseeing a largely capitalist society that enriches and benefits everybody at the top might be something that Kim is now seriously thinking about.
At the same time, Taiwan remains itself. Right?
Well, I mean, the Chinese are putting a lot of pressure on Taiwan right now. I don't know if you saw the news, but they've gotten the Dominican Republic to sever diplomatic relations with Taiwan this week because the Chinese allegedly paid the Dominicans $3 billion. That means there are only 18 countries that now recognize Taiwan, and China is slowly trying to get rid of all those countries. Their diplomatic ties to Taiwan and isolate Taiwan diplomatically. The Chinese ultimate goal is reunification, where they take control of Taiwan.
Yeah, by following the Chinese example, though, so do you think that when they do unify themselves, right? So would South playing the keyboard or the North?
Well, reunification of North and South Korea is way down here. We're only about here.
Okay.
So we have to first kind of like figure out what Kim wants, whether or not we're willing to pay the price, and whether or not he's willing to follow through on it. If those things occur, then you can start having discussions here about, well, are you interested in reunification? If you are, what will that take? My inclination, my guess, is that he's not really interested in reunification because that means he would have to give up control. So unless South Korea, as part of the deal, gives him like Samsung and he gets all the money for it, then I can't see him, agreeing to anything like
And
that.
if the South did do that, though, we still lose some incentives, right? To the South, though, of course, they certainly get less incentive than the North get if Kim surrenders.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, look, if we were standing in Berlin in the spring of 1989, and I was to say the Berlin Wall's coming down, I would have been laughed out of the room. So anything can happen.
Okay.
But right now, it seems unlikely that reunification is a serious topic until we deal with this issue of denuclearization.
In other words, nobody will jump on the reunification issue at the current time.
No, and I think right now, it's everyone is going to trust Kim a little bit, not a lot,
All right.
given his past
Trust
track
and
record.
verify.
Yeah,
Right.
I mean, President Reagan had it right then; he has it right now.
The trust and verify. That's probably the conclusion. My dear friends, we always keep our finger crossed for good things to happen. And yet, there are lessons to learn from the past, right? In the past, we've been cheated for more than one, more than two, more than several times. And then we have to be cautious. I never blame you for being cautious, trusting the North, right, of Korea. And the South, again, I'm looking at the picture, lots of emails say that what is incentive for the South? That is concern. South is lacking of an incentive, you are pushing North to do so. So they're doing okay already.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the South, the incentive is simple. They don't want to be at war with the North anymore. They want peace. They don't want to live under the threat of nuclear weapons.
Right.
I mean, in the United States, we worry about Kim lobbing missiles into, Hawaii or Alaska or the West Coast. In South Korea, they worry about the North Korean army rolling 15 miles across the border and right into Seoul. I don't think we really appreciate just how close Seoul and the capital are to the
They're only
DMZ.
45 kilometers away
Yeah,
from
I mean,
each other.
it's a stone's throw. So,
stone's throw, yeah.
because of that, I mean, that's why we have 28,000 American troops, stationed along the DMZ.
All right.
So I think from the South, they just want peace.
Okay, they want a peace call, right?
Yeah, because, again, technically both countries are still at war.
All right, my dear friends, today in the discussion about the northern Korean Peninsula situation, I have my dear friend, Honorable James Lee here, former presidential consultant for both George Bush, George H.W., and George W., 41 and 43, to shed lights on this issue. And after checking chapter after chapter after chapter of the questions or the events, though, we probably still want to keep our fingers crossed to see something, well, better than nothing, right? Something is better than nothing to happen. Anyway, I still have questions. Let's take a very short moment. When we come back, we really want to know our own positions, right? What if, and then what? What if, and then what? So like that kind. Hello, my dear friends, lovely audiences, ladies and gentlemen, my dear fellow Americans, welcome to the show. A talk about the North Korea situation. The whole peninsula is in question. It's a very hot subject these days. Okay, versus the whole thing, there is the United States. And the credit, of course, if it did happen, the credit, I should say, 100% go to America. Without America, things would not change that fast. So today, shedding lights on the issue is my good friend and a backbone to the community, former presidential consultant for both George H.W. Bush 41 and George W. Bush 43, and the glorious time of his service, and now he's still serving this community. Welcome, sir. I will get into the show. I'm getting excited.
Okay.
Right. Now, concern is lots of the emails I received is that what would the U.S. would we do if you say, number one, hey, Kim is playing games. Number two, Kim and Man, they're playing game altogether, right? They try to put us in a pocket,
Right.
right? So what shall we do in either case?
Well, I think, President Trump has made it very clear that if Kim is not sincere in some of these initial offers that he's making, if he's not sincere in denuclearization, we'll just keep the sanctions in place and keep putting the screws to North Korea. I think that much is very self-evident. So the question is, if Kim is not sincere and he's trying to buy time for himself, and we just have to make sure that we don't fall for it again. And I think because it's happened so many times before, the United States is going to have a very high bar for proof to allow any of this stuff to happen. So I think, it's like the old line, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me.
Yeah.
In this particular case, we're talking about fool me 3, 4, 5 times over the past 30 years. So, and it's been a vexing problem for all parties, Democrat or Republican. It didn't matter who's president. North Korea kind of pulled the wool over our eyes for everybody. So I think in President Trump's case, he's perfectly willing to listen, perfectly willing to kind of show up, for example, and hear what Kim has to say. But he's also perfectly willing to turn his back, walk away, and just attack the guy on Twitter for a week. So this kind of diplomacy is unheard of. It's unusual, but it appears to work. So we'll just have to kind of ride this out and see what happens.
Yeah, the public feels happy about we being tough again, right? And with or without the efforts of Donald Trump, we still want to be tough as we used to be. And we especially like to say, do it my way or the hard way, or like that kind of thing, right?
Sure.
But the thing is that doing it my way or the hard way, in between, there's time involved. What if the Kim says, okay, I need 5 months to denuclearize it, right? During the 5 months, do we accept it as condition, or do we say, hey, let's do it right away at this point?
Well,
And I want to be partaking in the destroyment.
Yeah.
So
I think the most important difference in this time around than other times is that President Trump, either by planning or by accident, depending on your point of view, has switched the diplomatic table where the North has to be the one to initiate. Every time before, the United States and its allies would make an offer, and North Korea would either say yes or no. The United States will make another offer, the North would say yes or no. The tables really turn now, where Trump doesn't really feel the need to make a deal, and he's forcing the North Koreans to make the concessions and to make the offers. So that's a very interesting development that we haven't seen in American diplomacy in a very long time. And so from that standpoint, it'll be interesting to see what Kim is willing to do, because frankly, let's be honest, Kim has made all the offers at this point. He's offered to come to the South. He's offered to send a unified team to the Olympics. He's offered to release the American prisoners. He's offered to stop the propaganda broadcast. He's offered to stop the missile testing and the nuclear testing. He's offered to decommission the nuclear site. He's offered to bring inspectors from the outside in. So those are all things that have happened. Now, we all know that those are all things we've asked for in the past, but North Korea has just simply said no, 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 no all the time. So now that he's doing it, we're obviously suspicious, but at some point you have to kind of say, okay, he's telling the truth. And that's where the verification process has to come in. We need to go in there and see whether or not all this stuff is happening. For example, when that summit happens between President Trump and President Kim, one of the things that's being talked about now is that President Trump will arrive, they'll have the summit, and then when he leaves, he's going to bring the 3 Americans out with him. That also would be a very significant...
Is it going to happen now?
Yeah, that would be,
or never happen.
yeah,
right?
that'll be a significant act on Kim's part. So,
I see.
for example, the President Trump is going to set these markers for Kim Jong Un to have to meet. And if Kim continues to meet them, then frankly, there might be a framework here to do a deal that's
In
verifiable.
other words, if I quote from you, the table being turned though, is that instead of we say yes or no, it is time for them to say, okay, now, Trump says, this is what I want to do. And you tell me yes or no. I'll just wait for you.
Well, Trump has very clearly, made his position known, and he's just going to sit back and wait. And that's what he's done with the North. He's told, Kim Jong-un through Mike Pompeo that, the United States is willing to do deals with you. The funny thing is that past presidents, whether or not it was George W. Bush or Barack Obama, the North has always wanted this legitimacy to be treated like an equal. So they've always asked for these summit meetings face to face. And the Americans have always said no.
All right.
President Trump, frankly, doesn't care. He's perfectly willing to do that. So in a lot of ways, because of President Trump's unpredictable nature and unconventional way of doing things, we have a breakthrough because he's willing to say, yeah, I don't care. I'll come and meet him. And if we don't do a deal, I'll walk away, and that's fine.
Well, it turns out good.
And it's turned out that, those stumbling blocks that were set for the preconditions, which prevented us in a lot of ways from being able to get to a certain point, aren't there anymore.
Sure. Oh, okay, the last concern. Thank you for that. And I first heard about this accidental target hit thing. We probably will get what we wanted. Okay, now, the only concern now is that if we fail, if we find out that Kim was playing games or whatsoever, or whoever is playing with Kim, what do we do? Are we back on chapter 1 to go ahead and attack him?
Well, we were never going to contemplate military strikes. The only way that we were going to contemplate military strikes is if they were able to fashion a nuclear device, put it on a missile, and then be able to shoot it. That would certainly require a response by us. But, right now, there are no real good options other than the option that we currently have, which is to isolate North Korea to such an extent where literally they can't get anything. And by continuing to apply pressure on China, we can actually, see a more clear path to get North Korea to do what they want. And the key here is really China. It's always been China. If China doesn't support North Korea has no options. So by putting pressure on China in a lot of ways, then you might be able to get them to move forward and take
from
action.
a humanitarian point of view, if the dictator does not care who dies or whatever of hunger, and of course the public, the international community has to aid the people, at least they deserve to live.
Yeah, normally, we've allowed UN shipments of food and supplies into North Korea. Those still occur, but at a much reduced level right now because these sanctions are incredibly difficult and incredibly tough. I'll give you an example. When the North Korean soldier defected in that televised escape attempt at the DMZ where he was shot at 5 times, they brought him in, the medical report was remarkable. This is a guy who had worms, dysentery, near starvation, only weighed, less than maybe 100 pounds. And this was a frontline.
And he was even a soldier.
Yeah, this was a frontline
soldier.
Who had
food supplies.
So you have to wonder about the state of the North Korean population as a whole.
Yes.
And I think that, if Kim were to not do a deal, he may very well end up being a leader of a country where basically everyone dies of starvation, which doesn't leave much of a country for him to rule.
And of course, is it possible we use the same way like we deal with Bin Laden? We just handpick him and get him taken care of.
Well, yeah. I think the strategy that the Trump administration is starting to coalesce is more accurately would be the 2003 example in Libya. Where Muammar Gaddafi was given the opportunity to give up all his nuclear research and technology in exchange Libya was granted a temporary seat on the UN Security Council. Some sanctions were lifted, and so forth. So you might see that kind of a deal fashion because there's a template for it. We know it worked, and it happened very quickly. So that might be a situation here where it might be replicated in this case.
And we will probably want to use the same thing that we did with Bin Laden.
Well, I mean, I don't think we were contemplating killing Kim, so that certainly doesn't help. I mean, Bin Laden's case, he was a terrorist on the run, and he wasn't in charge of any government. Kim is a duly elected head of state. You don't want to get into the habit of knocking off people's leaders because that develops into a much broader problem for everybody else around
But
the world.
Iraq had the same thing.
Well, Iraq is again, in Saddam Hussein's case, he was overthrown from power, and his own people, the Iraqi provisional government, tried him and condemned him and executed him. It wasn't a U.S. firing squad that did it.
All right, good. My dear friends, today is one of the very rare chances that we get touch base with Honorable James Lee, getting lights on this issue. There are lots of concerns. The public is worried about it a lot. Basically, what we're worrying is that, can we be trapped? Right? Maybe we get trapped, right? What if we get trapped? So, do we have enough plan, either retaliation or attack whatsoever, lined for that day? So that's the last question.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, we have sufficient military assets to address any kind of military response to North Korea. I mean, we have, like I said before, we have 28,000 troops on the DMZ, bolstered by South Korea's troops. The Ninth Fleet is home ported in Japan. So our assets there are considerable, not to mention what we can fly there as well. So the intention of those assets is never to try to conquer North Korea. It's just merely to protect South Korea and Japan. So to the extent that we would take military action, it would only be if North Korea were to take a provocative act.
Oh, I see.
Which right now we don't obviously see that.
Only when we're out of options.
Yeah.
Right.
I think everyone agrees that that's
And on the bright side, though, if things go better than we thought, right? Okay, and there is only a saying by Donald Trump that we will back off military presence in even the South Korea.
Yeah.
So would that happen? Was that a overstatement?
Sure. I mean, the framework of an agreement has always been there. It's been that the United States has always maintained, look, if North Korea and South Korea sign a peace agreement, if the United States and UN sign a peace agreement, if North Korea denuclearizes, if it gives up its ballistic missile capacity, if it improves its human rights situation, if it opens up its border, then it's entirely possible that the United States remove most, if not all, of its combat troops there and only keeps a token presence. That's been a major objective of the North Koreans
Certainly
for a
the
long
thought
time.
will still remain there, right?
Yeah, and that particular structure has always been there. The North has always said, to legitimize its nuclear program, well, we have to have nuclear weapons because the United States is on our doorstep. If the United States is not on our doorstep, that takes away the legitimate argument from the North Korean side of why they need nuclear weapons. So it's entirely possible that you could see some serious
It is
horse trading.
possible, but to a certain extent.
Yeah, and if we believe that Donald Trump is the master of the deal, he has an opportunity to really make a blockbuster deal here.
All right, so far. Okay, very good, my dear friends. I try not to go over time. Well, we did go over time. It's worth it. Lovely audience, and thank you very much for watching. With me, Honorable James Lee, former presidential consultant for both George H.W. Bush 41 and George W. Bush. He is now shedding light to the community about the concerns that I received from my email. So thank you, sir, for shedding light. Thank you for coming, especially when you come through such a traffic.
Well, it's always good to be here, Jack.
All right, good. Thank you.